The first emergency call came through at 3:47 hours, when most of Bagram Airfield was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller's voice carried that particular strain of controlled panic that separates routine missions from the ones people remember. 6 Navy SEALs pinned down in the Korangal Valley, ammunition running critical, Taliban fighters closing from 3 sides. The quick reaction force was 30 minutes out. They had maybe 10. The tower controller's hand hovered over the alert roster, scanning for available close air support. One name appeared: Captain Nolan Reese, call sign Hatchet, flying an A-10 Thunderbolt II that had been scheduled for maintenance rotation. The controller hesitated. Reese had a reputation, though not the kind that usually inspired confidence during crisis situations. Single father, always leaving exactly on time, never volunteering for the extended rotations that built careers. Other pilots whispered he'd lost his edge, that becoming a widower with a 6-year-old daughter waiting in base housing had made him cautious, calculating, unwilling to push boundaries. But the screen showed no alternatives, and those SEALs were running out of seconds. When the alert sounded in the ready room, Reese was already geared up, reviewing topographical maps with the methodical precision that younger pilots mistook for overthinking. He acknowledged the scramble order without hesitation, his movements toward the aircraft economical, practiced, absent of the aggressive swagger that characterized the squadron's rising stars. The maintenance chief flagged him down on the taxiway, concern evident even in the dim glow of the runway lights. The A-10 Reese was about to fly had a known issue with the right engine's restart system, documented but deemed non-critical since standard procedures never required airborne restarts. Reese nodded once, filed the information somewhere in his mind, and continued his taxi to the active runway. The Thunderbolt's twin turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic high-pitched whine, a sound that always reminded Reese of something between a banshee and a very angry vacuum cleaner. The aircraft was never beautiful, never graceful. It looked exactly like what it was: a flying bathtub built around a 30mm rotary cannon, designed to absorb punishment and deliver devastating close air support. As Reese advanced the throttles and felt the familiar weight of acceleration pressing him back into his seat, he thought briefly of Maya asleep in their small base apartment, her nightlight casting constellation, patterns across walls decorated with her crayon drawings of airplanes. Then he compartmentalized that thought, locked it away in the mental space reserved for after mission, and focused entirely on the darkness ahead and the men who needed him to be perfect. The valley terrain was unforgiving even in daylight. At night, flying low enough to effectively support ground troops while avoiding the mountain peaks that rose like broken teeth on either side required absolute focus and trust in instruments. Reese descended through 8,000 feet, his eyes scanning both the heads-up display and the landscape visible only as varying shades of black and darker black through his night vision equipment. The JTAC's voice came through his headset, call sign Viper 6, providing coordinates and describing a situation deteriorating by the minute. The SEALs had taken casualties. One team member was unconscious, possibly critical. They'd managed to establish a defensive position in a dried riverbed, but Taliban fighters were maneuvering for high ground on both sides. Reese acknowledged the information, his voice calm, professional, asking the questions that would build his tactical picture without adding to the chaos on the ground. The first gun run would be critical. Reese dropped to 4,000 feet, setting up his approach angle to maximize the effectiveness of his cannon, while minimizing any risk to the SEAL position. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger was arguably the most effective close air support weapon ever mounted on an aircraft, capable of firing 70 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition that could shred light armor and neutralize enemy positions with brutal efficiency. But precision mattered more than firepower when friendlies were danger close. Reese's hands moved across the weapons panel with practiced efficiency, selecting his ammunition load, double-checking his targeting parameters, breathing slowly to keep his heart rate controlled. Below him, 6 men were counting on his ability to thread the needle between salvation and catastrophe. Viper 6 talked him onto target, describing enemy positions relative to an illumination mark visible through Reese's targeting pod. Reese could see the thermal signatures now, multiple heat sources moving through the darkness, closing on the SEAL position from the northeast ridge. He rolled into his attack angle, responding with the heavy, deliberate handling characteristics that made it feel less like flying and more like directing controlled falling. The targeting pipper settled on the lead enemy position. Reese's finger rested on the trigger. One breath. Two. Then the night exploded with the distinctive roar of the GAU-8, a sound so loud and violent it could be felt in the chest cavity from miles away, like God's own chainsaw tearing through reality. The effect on target was immediate and devastating. The thermal imaging showed enemy positions erupting in bright flashes as 30mm rounds impacted at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The Taliban advance from the northeast ridge collapsed, fighters either killed outright or breaking contact to seek cover. Viper 6's voice came through with barely restrained relief, confirming good hits, no friendly casualties from the gun run. But the celebration lasted only seconds before reality reasserted itself. More enemy fighters were pushing from the western approach, and the SEALs' ammunition status was now critical. They needed resupply, medical evacuation, and continued close air support in that order. Reese pulled up from his gun run, already planning his next approach, when the right engine coughed once twice, then died completely. The A-10 was famous for its survivability, designed to fly home on one engine, to absorb battle damage that would destroy other aircraft, to keep fighting when lesser machines would fall from the sky. But losing an engine at low altitude over mountain terrain at night was nobody's idea of an acceptable situation. Reese felt the immediate yaw as asymmetric thrust tried to push the aircraft into a spin. His hands and feet responded automatically, applying opposite rudder, adjusting throttle on the remaining engine, maintaining airspeed above the minimum required to keep flying. The aircraft steadied, but was now operating at reduced capability. More concerning, his fuel consumption had just increased significantly, and his ability to maintain station over the SEAL position was now measured in minutes rather than hours. The tower controller's voice came through, steady but urgent, asking for Reese's status and intentions. Standard procedure was clear. Single-engine operation mandated immediate return to base, especially at night over hostile terrain. The response from command was already predictable before Reese heard it. Return to Bagram, preserve the aircraft. Another asset would be scrambled to take over the mission. Reese looked at his fuel gauge, did the mental math calculating time to base versus time the SEALs could hold their position. The numbers didn't align favorably. He thought of Maya, of promises made to always come home, of being both mother and father to a little girl who'd already lost too much. Then he thought of 6 men in a riverbed who'd made promises too, who had families waiting, who needed someone to keep fighting when the easy answer was to leave. His thumb moved to the radio transmit button. Instead of acknowledging the return to base order, Reese keyed the JTAC frequency. His voice carried no drama, no heroic declaration, just simple professional inquiry. He asked Viper 6 for an updated tactical picture, for enemy disposition, for exactly how long the SEALs could hold before being overrun. The answer confirmed what Reese already suspected. The quick reaction force was still 20 minutes out. Without continued air support, the SEAL team wouldn't last 10. The choice crystallized with absolute clarity. Reese could follow orders, preserve himself and his aircraft, and listen later to the casualty reports. Or he could stay, burn through his remaining fuel-supporting men who'd run out of options, and figure out the consequences afterward. It wasn't really a choice at all. The second gun run was harder, the wallowing slightly with asymmetric power, requiring constant corrections to maintain attack parameters. But Reese had been flying Thunderbolts for 12 years, had accumulated more combat hours than most pilots would see in entire careers. The aircraft responded to his inputs like an extension of his own body, sluggish but obedient. He rolled in on the western enemy position, letting the targeting pipper settle, breathing through the turbulence and the adrenaline. The GAU-8 roared again, another brilliant display of firepower that lit the valley floor like daylight. Viper 6 confirmed kills, his voice carrying gratitude that didn't need explicit expression. The western attack collapsed as completely as the northeastern advance had. But now Reese's fuel gauge was approaching critical levels, and the single remaining engine was showing temperature readings higher than optimal. The maintenance chief's earlier warning about the restart system echoed in Reese's memory. The right engine had shut down cleanly. No fire, no catastrophic failure, just a loss of power that could potentially be recovered. Standard procedure for airborne restart existed, though it was rarely attempted in combat situations and never recommended with a known fault in the restart mechanism. Reese pulled the A-10 into a climb, gaining altitude that would give him options if the restart attempt failed catastrophically. His hands moved through the restart checklist, each step committed to muscle memory from hundreds of simulator sessions and a handful of training exercises. The valley dropped away beneath him as he climbed through 10,000 feet, and for a moment there was only the darkness and the steady thrum of his single operating engine. The restart sequence required precise timing and careful monitoring of multiple systems simultaneously. Reese positioned the throttle, activated the ignition system, monitored exhaust gas temperature and turbine speed. The right engine remained silent, the restart mechanism failing exactly as the maintenance chief had warned it might. Reese ran through the sequence again, adjusting parameters, trying to coax life back into dead metal and unresponsive systems. Nothing. Below him, Viper 6 reported renewed enemy contact from the south, another wave of Taliban fighters pushing toward the SEAL position. The quick reaction force was still 15 minutes out. The mathematics of survival were getting increasingly grim. Reese made a decision that would later be analyzed in training courses, debated in safety reviews, and quietly added to the informal encyclopedia of things pilots do when regulations meet reality. He pushed the A-10 into a dive, trading altitude for airspeed, building velocity that would compress airflow through the dead engine. It was a technique from the earliest days of jet aviation, rarely documented in modern manuals, the kind of knowledge passed between pilots over beers rather than written in official procedures. The airspeed indicator climbed past 200 knots, then 250, the aircraft shaking slightly as it accelerated through increasingly dense air. At 300 knots, Reese executed the restart sequence one more time, the increased airflow potentially providing enough compression to overcome the faulty restart mechanism. The right engine coughed, sputtered, and then caught with a sound that was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying thing Reese had ever heard. The turbine spooled up, exhaust gas temperature spiked then stabilized, and suddenly the A-10 had full power again. Reese pulled out of his dive at 6,000 feet, both engines running, asymmetric thrust corrected, the aircraft responding like it had been given a second chance at life. He didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the magnitude of what he'd just accomplished. Instead, he keyed the radio to Viper 6 and asked for targeting coordinates on the southern enemy approach. There was work still to do. The remaining mission unfolded with the methodical efficiency of a professional at the peak of his capability. Reese made 3 more gun runs, expending his remaining 30mm ammunition with devastating precision. Each attack broke enemy momentum, forced Taliban fighters to seek cover rather than press their advantage, bought precious minutes for the SEALs to maintain their defensive position. When his cannon went dry, Reese switched to marking targets with his own aircraft, orbiting low enough to draw fire, providing the approaching quick reaction force with exact enemy positions. He took small arms fire on 2 passes, heard the distinctive metallic impacts of bullets striking his fuselage, felt the absorbed punishment exactly as it was designed to do. When the quick reaction force finally arrived, Black Hawks descending into the valley with door gunners laying suppressive fire, Reese remained overhead, coordinating the extraction, ensuring no enemy forces could reposition for a final attack. He watched the SEALs board the helicopters, watched the wounded loaded carefully onto stretchers, watched the whole operation execute with the precision of professionals who understood exactly how close they'd come to disaster. Only when Viper 6 confirmed all personnel secure and helicopters airborne did Reese turn his battered A-10 toward Bagram. His fuel gauge showed levels that made the return flight a calculated risk rather than a certainty. But calculated risks were something Reese understood intimately. The landing was unremarkable, a simple return to Earth that belied the complexity of the preceding hours. Reese taxied to his hardstand, shut down both engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment before beginning his post-flight inspection. The maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft, documenting bullet impacts, examining the right engine that had died and been resurrected mid-mission, shaking their heads at damage patterns that confirmed just how close things had been. The maintenance chief appeared at the cockpit ladder, his expression caught between professional concern and reluctant admiration. He asked the question everyone would ask. How had Reese managed to restart an engine with a known faulty mechanism? Reese just shrugged, described his dive procedure, and suggested they document it for the maintenance logs. The after-action report took hours, every detail scrutinized, every decision examined. The operations officer wanted to understand why Reese hadn't immediately returned to base after losing his engine. Reese explained the tactical situation, the timeline, the mathematics of 6 men versus 1 aircraft. His voice remained level, factual, absent of any suggestion that he'd done something extraordinary. He'd simply evaluated the situation and made the decision that seemed most appropriate given the circumstances. That the decision involved significant personal risk was relevant but not determinative. That it violated standard procedures was acknowledged but contextualized by mission requirements. The operations officer listened, made notes, and eventually dismissed Reese with an expression that suggested this conversation would continue through official channels. Reese walked back to base housing as dawn broke over Bagram, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink that made them look almost peaceful. He opened the apartment door quietly, hopping not to wake Maya. But she was already up, sitting at the small kitchen table in her pajamas, coloring a picture of an airplane. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made everything else fade to insignificance. Reese scooped her into his arms, held her tight, breathed in the scent of children's shampoo and innocence. She asked if he'd been flying. He said yes. She asked if he'd been safe. He said always. Some truths were more important than absolute accuracy. The recognition came later, through channels both official and informal. The 6 SEALs Reese had supported sent a message through command, requesting to meet the A-10 pilot who'd stayed when he should have left, who'd restarted his aircraft midair when every regulation said it was impossible, who'd burned through his fuel and taken ground fire to keep them alive. The meeting happened 3 days later, 6 lean men with hard eyes and the particular bearing of special operations personnel. They didn't salute, didn't stand on ceremony. They just shook Reese's hand, one after another, their grips firm, their eyes communicating gratitude that transcended language. The team leader, Viper 6 himself, mentioned that one of the wounded SEALs had made it to surgery with minutes to spare, that doctors had initially given him minimal chance of survival, that he was now stable and expected to recover fully. The story spread through the base with the particular velocity reserved for moments that remind everyone why they serve. The single dad who never volunteered for extra missions, who left exactly on time to read bedtime stories, who'd been quietly written off as past his prime. The same pilot had just restarted an aircraft midair using a procedure from another era, stayed over target on a single engine with fuel running critical, and delivered close air support precise enough to save 6 lives without a single friendly casualty. Other pilots approached Reese differently now, questions replacing assumptions, respect replacing dismissal. The squadron commander pulled him aside, mentioned that his actions were being forwarded for recognition, that medals would probably follow, that his career trajectory had just changed significantly. But Reese's life didn't change in the ways people expected. He still left exactly on time, still prioritized bedtime stories over additional flight hours, still moved through the squadron with quiet competence rather than aggressive ambition. The difference was internal, invisible, a recalibration of how others perceived what had always been there. The precise instrument work that had restarted his engine was the same precision he applied to every flight. The calculated risk-taking that kept him over target was the same calculation he used raising a daughter alone. The willingness to push beyond comfortable limits when it mattered was the same willingness that defined single parenthood after loss. Nothing about Reese had changed. Everything about how people saw him had transformed completely. Maya noticed her father was suddenly more popular at base events, that other pilots stopped to talk, that families approached them at the commissary with expressions of gratitude and respect. She asked him about it one evening while they were building a puzzle together, her 6-year-old perception cutting through adult complexity to fundamental questions. Why were people being nicer? Had something happened? Reese considered his response carefully, wanting to be truthful without burdening her with details she didn't need. He explained that sometimes people don't understand what someone can do until they see it demonstrated. That being underestimated wasn't necessarily bad. It just meant you had opportunities to surprise people. Maya thought about this for a moment, then returned to the puzzle, satisfied with an answer that made sense in her world. The maintenance crews eventually figured out the restart issue on Reese's A-10, a combination of factors that had created the perfect conditions for failure followed by the perfect conditions for success. They documented his mid-air restart procedure, adding it to the informal knowledge base that exists alongside official manuals, the kind of information pilots share when regulations meet reality. The aircraft itself was repaired, the bullet impacts patched, the engines serviced, and it returned to flight status bearing the scars of that night in the Koringal Valley. Maintenance personnel developed a particular fondness for that specific Thunderbolt, treating it with the special attention reserved for aircraft that had proven themselves under fire and brought their pilots home alive. 6 months later, during a routine ceremony recognizing various achievements and milestones, Reese received formal commendation for his actions that night. The citation used careful language that acknowledged both the results achieved and the procedures circumvented, praising his judgment while avoiding any suggestion that ignoring single-engine return-to-base protocols was generally acceptable. Reese stood at attention while the squadron commander read the citation, Maya watching from the audience in a dress she'd insisted on wearing, because it was important to look nice when Daddy was being recognized. The other pilots applauded, but the loudest response came from 6 SEALs who traveled specifically to attend, standing in the back of the room, their presence communicating more than any citation ever could. The mission became part of squadron lore, told to new pilots as both inspiration and cautionary tale. The details evolved slightly with each retelling, some versions emphasizing the technical achievement of the mid-air restart, others focusing on the decision to remain over target against orders, still others highlighting the precision of the gun runs and the mathematics of fuel management. But the core narrative remained constant. A pilot everyone had underestimated, proving that quiet competence often matters more than loud confidence, that the calculations of parenthood and combat aviation weren't so different, that sometimes the most extraordinary actions look like simple professional execution when performed by someone genuinely skilled. Reese continued flying A-10s until his daughter graduated high school, accumulating more combat hours, more close air support missions, more quiet saves that never made official reports. He became the pilot younger aviators sought for advice, not because he was flashy or aggressive, but because he understood the job at a level that transcended technical proficiency. He taught them about precision, about risk calculation, about the difference between courage and recklessness. Mostly, he taught them that being underestimated was just another form of tactical advantage, that letting others assume limits you didn't actually have meant you could surprise them when it mattered most. His call sign, Hatchet, took on new meaning, less about aggression and more about the tool that splits wood cleanly, that does necessary work without drama or excess. The SEALs stayed in touch, occasional messages through channels both official and personal, updates on careers and families, quiet acknowledgments of a bond formed in darkness over a valley in Afghanistan. One of them, the wounded operator who'd nearly died, sent a picture 5 years later of his newborn daughter, the message simple and profound. The doctors had said he wouldn't survive to see his next birthday, let alone become a father. He wanted Reese to know that every moment with his daughter was a gift Reese had made possible. The photo went into a box of mementos Reese kept in his desk, alongside Maya's crayon drawings of airplanes, and the unofficial mission patch someone had created showing an A-10 with one engine on fire and the words "Hatchet" restarted midair around the border. Maya eventually went to college, studied aerospace engineering, and often told the story of her father's most famous mission to classmates who didn't quite believe the details. She'd learned the technical aspects now, understood the aerodynamics and engine mechanics that made the midair restart so improbable, could calculate the fuel consumption and mission timeline that made staying over target so risky. The understanding only deepened her respect for what her father had accomplished that night, for all the nights before and after when he'd flown into darkness to support people who needed help. She pursued her degree with the same quiet competence he'd demonstrated throughout her childhood, letting her work speak louder than any self-promotion, surprising professors and peers who underestimated the determined young woman from a military family. Reese retired eventually, the mountains of Afghanistan replaced by the mountains of Montana, flying replaced by teaching at a small aviation program that trained the next generation of pilots. His reputation preceded him, students arriving already familiar with the story of the single dad who'd restarted his A-10 midair, who'd stayed over target against orders, who'd saved 6 lives through a combination of skill, judgment, and calculated risk. But Reese taught them other things, less dramatic but equally important: how to read weather patterns before the instruments confirmed them, how to maintain focus during long missions when fatigue tried to erode precision, how to make decisions under pressure without letting panic compress the decision space, how to balance confidence with humility, aggression with restraint, courage with calculation. The sky above Montana wasn't so different from the sky above Afghanistan, the same stars and darkness, the same vast spaces that made human concerns feel both insignificant and profoundly important. Reese would sometimes stand outside his small house in the evenings, looking up at constellations he'd navigated by during countless night missions, remembering the weight of an A-10 stick in his hand, the sound of SEALs' voices in his headset, the moment when a dead engine coughed back to life against all reasonable expectations. The memories were neither burden nor badge, just part of the accumulated experience that defined who he'd become, a single father who'd made impossible decisions look like simple professional execution, who'd been underestimated until the moment he proved everyone's assumptions catastrophically wrong. The final detail of that night in the Korangal Valley emerged years later, through a chance conversation at a veterans gathering. One of the SEALs, now retired himself, mentioned something he'd noticed during the mission but never officially reported. During the most critical moments, when Reese's fuel was at emergency levels and he was still making gun runs, the JTAC had heard something unexpected in the brief pauses between radio transmissions. Very faint, barely audible, the sound of Reese humming, Not nervously, not unconsciously, but with the particular rhythm of someone keeping time, maintaining focus, using an old trick to regulate breathing and heart rate during extreme stress. The melody was simple, childlike, something a 6-year-old might request at bedtime. The seal had recognized it for what it was, a father carrying his daughter with him into combat, drawing strength from the future waiting at home, staying human even when the situation demanded he transcend human limitations. He'd never mentioned it because some things were too personal, too sacred to reduce to official record. But he wanted Reese to know he'd heard it, understood it, drew his own strength from knowing that the pilot keeping them alive was anchored to something beyond mission parameters and tactical objectives. Reese listened to this revelation quietly, nodded once, and said nothing at all. Some truths needed no acknowledgement beyond the recognition that they'd been witnessed and understood.